The sun was setting over the quiet countryside, casting a golden glow across the fields. The air smelled of fresh earth and hay, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant chirping of crickets. James Anderson stood by the wooden fence that bordered his modest farm, gazing out at the rows of crops he had worked so hard to grow. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his muscles sore but satisfied from another long day of labor. At 38 years old, James was strong and sturdy, with broad shoulders and hands calloused from years of hard work. His dark skin gleamed under the fading sunlight as he took a deep breath, enjoying the peace of the evening. But peace wasn't always easy to come by for James, not here, not in this town. Though he had lived on this land for nearly 5 years, he still felt like an outsider. It wasn't because of anything he had done, it was simply because of who he was, a black man in a predominantly white community. Most people in town kept their distance, speaking politely if they crossed paths but never going out of their way to befriend him. Some even whispered behind his back, questioning why he had chosen to settle here in the first place. James didn't let it bother him too much, at least not outwardly. Inside, however, he carried a quiet sadness. He hadn't moved to this rural area looking for trouble or attention. After serving in the Marines for over a decade, including tours in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, he had craved a simpler life, a life where he could wake up every morning to the sound of birds instead of gunfire, where his biggest worry would be whether the rain would hold off until harvest season. This farm was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where he could heal from the scars of war and build something meaningful away from the chaos of battlefields. Yet lately, there had been signs that trouble might follow him even here. Over the past few weeks, stories had spread through town about a gang of young men causing havoc in the area. They called themselves the Patriots, though their actions were anything but patriotic. Driven by hatred and ignorance, they targeted anyone they deemed different. Immigrants, minorities, anyone who didn't fit their narrow idea of what a real American should look like. Their methods ranged from vandalism to outright violence, and no one dared stand up to them. Fear ruled the town, silencing even those who disagreed with their hateful rhetoric. James had heard the rumors, of course. He'd seen evidence of their mischief himself. Just last week, he found tire tracks cutting through one of his cornfields, ruining weeks' worth of growth. At first, he thought it might have been teenagers joyriding, but then he noticed spray-painted words on the side of his barn: "Go home." The message was crude, written in jagged red letters that dripped down the weathered wood like blood. It wasn't hard to guess who was responsible. Still, James refused to let anger take root in his heart. He cleaned up the mess, repaired what he could, and went about his daily routine as if nothing had happened. But deep inside, a storm brewed. Memories of his time in the military came flooding back. Memories he had tried so hard to bury. He had fought for freedom, for justice, for the rights of all people to live without fear. And now here he was, facing prejudice in a place he had hoped would offer refuge. The irony stung. One evening, as James sat on his porch sipping a cup of coffee, he spotted movement near the edge of his property. Squinting into the dim light, he saw 3 figures lingering by the fence. They weren't trying to hide. In fact, they seemed to want him to notice them. One of them pointed in his direction, laughing loudly enough for James to hear. Another flicked a cigarette onto the ground and crushed it under his boot. All 3 wore matching leather jackets adorned with patches bearing symbols James recognized. Instantly, swastikas and other hate-filled emblems. For a moment, James considered ignoring them. Maybe they'd get bored and leave. But when one of them shouted, "Hey you, yeah you," he knew avoiding confrontation wasn't an option. Setting his coffee mug down, he rose slowly to his feet and walked toward them. His strides were deliberate, measured, exuding a calm confidence that masked the turmoil within. As he approached, he studied their faces, pale, angry, filled with misplaced bravado. These weren't soldiers or warriors. They were cowards hiding behind numbers and slogans. "What do you want?" James asked, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. One of the men stepped forward, sneering. "We just wanted to remind you that this isn't your kind of place," he said, spitting on the ground for emphasis. "You stick out like a sore thumb around here." James clenched his jaw but kept his composure. "This is my home," he replied firmly. "I've worked hard to make it mine, and I'm not leaving." The leader of the group smirked, clearly unimpressed. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning to his friends. With one last glare, they sauntered off into the night, leaving James standing alone in the cool breeze. As he watched them disappear into the shadows, a chill ran down his spine. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The question weighing heavily on his mind was whether he could protect his home without resorting to the very violence he despised. Could he find a way to stand his ground without becoming what they accused him of being? For now, answers eluded him. But one thing was certain: James Anderson wasn't about to give up without a fight. The days that followed were anything but peaceful for James Anderson. The gang's visit wasn't just a warning, it was the start of something far more sinister. Each morning brought new evidence of their hostility, each act designed to wear him down and drive him away. At first it was subtle, rocks thrown at his windows late at night, leaving cracked spiderwebbing across the glass. Then came slashed tractor tires, rendering his equipment useless and delaying his work on the farm. Every time James fixed one problem, another arose, like an endless cycle meant to break his spirit. One particularly frustrating day, James returned from town with supplies only to find crude graffiti spray-painted across the side of his barn. The words were hateful, filled with racial slurs and threats. "Leave or else," they read in jagged letters. James stood there for a long moment, staring at the vandalism, his jaw tightening with every passing second. He had seen worse during his time overseas: bombs, bloodshed, destruction. But this felt different. This was personal. It wasn't just an attack on his property. It was an assault on his dignity, his humanity. Neighbors noticed the escalating tension. Some stopped by to express sympathy, offering kind words or help cleaning up the mess. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads but doing little else. Fear kept most people quiet. No one wanted to cross the Patriots, not when retaliation could mean losing their own homes or livelihoods. Even those who disapproved of the gang's actions hesitated to intervene, afraid of becoming targets themselves. James didn't blame them. He understood fear better than anyone. After years of combat, he knew how paralyzing it could be, how it could make good people stand aside while injustice unfolded. But understanding didn't make it any easier to swallow. He couldn't help feeling isolated, like he was fighting this battle alone. Still, he refused to let despair take hold. Instead, he channeled his frustration into action, scrubbing away the graffiti and patching up the damage as best he could. Each repair was a small victory, a way of reclaiming control over his life. Despite his resolve, the constant harassment began to wear on him. Sleep became elusive, his nights plagued by restless tossing and turning. When he did manage to drift off, nightmares haunted him, visions of war blending with scenes of the gang closing in on his farm. During the day, fatigue shadowed his movements, slowing him down just enough to remind him of the toll this fight was taking. Yet James pressed on, determined not to give in to exhaustion or despair. One evening, as he walked back from the market carrying groceries, he encountered 3 members of the Patriots loitering near the edge of his property. They leaned casually against a rusted pickup truck, smoking cigarettes and laughing loudly. When they spotted James approaching, their laughter turned into sneers. One of them nudged the others, nodding toward him. James slowed his pace but didn't stop. He knew running would only embolden them further. "Well, well, look who we have here," one of the men called out mockingly as James drew closer. "It's our favorite farmer." James ignored the taunt, keeping his focus straight ahead. But the leader of the group stepped into his path, blocking his way. Up close, James could see the malice in his eyes, the twisted satisfaction of someone who thrived on intimidation. "I thought we told you to leave," the man said, his voice dripping with venom. "Or are you too stupid to understand plain English?" James stopped then, setting the grocery bags down gently beside him. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but there was a flicker of steel in his gaze. "This is my home," he said firmly, meeting the man's stare without flinching. "And I'm not going anywhere." The leader smirked, clearly amused by James's defiance. "You sure about that?" he asked, taking a step closer. Without warning, he shoved James hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. James caught himself before he fell, his hands balling into fists instinctively. For a brief moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. "You think you're tough, huh?" the man continued, stepping closer again. "We'll be back, and next time you won't get off so easy." James didn't respond. He simply straightened up, picked up his groceries, and walked past them without another word. As he disappeared, down the dirt road leading to his farmhouse, the gang erupted into mocking laughter. Their voices echoed behind him, sharp and cruel, but James didn't look back. He had faced worse enemies than these cowards, and he knew deep down that their bravado was hollow, a mask hiding their insecurities. That night, James sat in his kitchen, staring at the Medal of Honor tucked away in a small wooden box on the counter. He hadn't touched it in years, hadn't even thought about it much since leaving the Marines. But now, as memories of battles fought and lives lost flooded his mind, he found himself drawn to it. Picking it up, he ran his fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the weight of its significance. This medal represented everything he had sacrificed, everything he had fought for. Freedom, justice, equality. And yet here he was, facing hatred and prejudice in a place he had hoped would offer refuge. Could he protect himself without becoming what they accused him of being? Could he defend his home without resorting to violence? These questions swirled in his mind like storm clouds, heavy and unrelenting. James knew he couldn't avoid confrontation forever. Sooner or later, the Patriots would return, and when they did, he would need to be ready. But readiness didn't mean giving in to anger or fear. It meant finding strength in the values he had always stood for, even if it cost him everything. As he placed the medal back in its box and closed the lid, James made a silent vow. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't back down. Not because he sought revenge, but because he believed in something greater than himself. He believed in the power of resilience, in the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. And though the road ahead promised to be difficult, James knew one thing for certain: he would face it with courage no matter what. The days that followed were tense, each one heavier than the last. James Anderson went about his routine as usual, tending to his crops and fixing what the gang had damaged. But beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. He knew it was only a matter of time before the Patriots returned, and when they did, they wouldn't come alone. Their earlier visits had been warnings, tests to see how far they could push him. Now, emboldened by their growing numbers and reckless confidence, they were ready to escalate. James prepared as best he could. He reinforced the wooden fence around his property, nailed loose boards back into place, and even moved some tools inside the house just in case. His shotgun, which he rarely used except for scaring off stray animals, now rested within easy reach. Yet despite these precautions, James felt uneasy. This wasn't a battle he wanted to fight. Violence had never been his answer. It had been forced upon him too many times before. Still, he couldn't ignore the reality staring him in the face. If he didn't stand his ground, they would take everything from him. One afternoon, while working in the fields, James noticed a group of trucks parked along the edge of his property. Men spilled out of them, their leather jackets emblazoned with the same hateful symbols he'd seen before. There were at least a dozen of them this time, armed with bats, chains, and crowbars. They gathered near the barn, laughing and shouting, their voices carrying across the quiet countryside like thunderclouds rolling in. James watched them from a distance, his heart pounding but his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, without hesitation, he walked toward them. Every step felt deliberate, measured, as though he were stepping onto a battlefield once again. Memories of war flashed through his mind, explosions, gunfire, comrades falling beside him. But he pushed them aside. This wasn't Iraq or Afghanistan. This was his home, his sanctuary, and no one was going to take it away from him. When James reached the group, they turned to face him, their sneers twisting into cruel smiles. "Look who decided to show up," one of them jeered, twirling a chain in his hand. Another stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "We gave you plenty of chances to leave," the leader said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess we'll have to make you regret sticking around." For a moment, silence hung thick between them. The tension was palpable, like the calm before a storm. James stood tall, his hands visible to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This is my land, and I've worked too hard to let cowards like you take it from me." His words ignited fury in the gang. With a roar, two men lunged at him, swinging their weapons wildly. James reacted instantly, his body moving with precision honed through years of military training. He sidestepped the first attacker, grabbing his arm and using his momentum to send him sprawling to the ground. The second man swung his bat, but James ducked under it, driving an elbow into his ribs. The crack of impact echoed through the air as the man doubled over, gasping for breath. The rest of the gang hesitated, stunned by the speed and efficiency of James's movements. None of them had expected such resistance. Encouraged by their leader's shouts, however, they surged forward, surrounding him. Chains whipped through the air. Bats swung dangerously close, but James remained calm, almost eerily so. He dodged and countered with fluid grace, disarming one attacker after another. A swift kick sent one man stumbling backward into his companions. A well-placed punch dropped another to his knees. Each movement was calculated, efficient, designed not just to defend but to neutralize. Despite their numbers, the gang quickly realized they were outmatched. One by one they fell, clutching injuries or crawling away in defeat. Their leader, watching from the sidelines, grew increasingly agitated. "Get him!" he screamed, panic creeping into his voice, but his commands fell on deaf ears. His followers were too afraid to approach the man who seemed untouchable, unstoppable. Finally, the leader himself charged at James, wielding a heavy length of pipe. James waited until the last possible moment, then stepped aside, letting the man's own momentum carry him past. In one smooth motion, James grabbed the pipe, yanked it from the leader's grip, and tossed it aside. Before the man could recover, James delivered a single, precise blow, a punch that sent him crumpling to the ground. When the dust settled, the gang lay scattered across James's yard, groaning in pain or struggling to crawl away. Not a single blow had landed on James. He stood amidst the wreckage, breathing evenly, his posture unwavering. For a long moment there was only silence, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. James looked down at the defeated men, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction, only a deep weariness, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He had fought battles like this before, not against gangs, but against enemies on foreign soil, and every time the aftermath left him questioning whether violence ever truly solved anything. Still, he had done what he had to do. He had protected his home, his peace, his dignity. As the gang members struggled to their feet and limped toward their trucks, James called out to them. "If you come back here again," he said, his voice steady and firm, "you'll regret it. Leave me alone, and we won't have any more problems." They didn't respond, too humiliated to meet his gaze. Within minutes, their trucks roared to life, kicking up clouds of dust as they sped away. James watched them disappear down the road, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Then, turning back toward his farmhouse, he began, picking up the debris left behind by the fight. Broken chains, dented bats, scraps of clothing, all evidence of the chaos that had unfolded. As he worked, a sense of quiet resolve settled over him. He had faced hatred head-on and emerged victorious. But the victory felt hollow. It wasn't enough to win a fight. What mattered was building something stronger than hate, something that could endure long after the scars healed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat on his porch, staring out at the fields he had fought so hard to protect. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and grass. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of peace, not because the threat was gone, but because he had proven to himself that he could stand firm in the face of adversity. Whatever happened next, he knew he wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire through the small community. By dawn, neighbors who had once kept their distance began gathering outside James Anderson's farmhouse, their faces a mix of curiosity, awe, and guilt. Some brought food, pies, casseroles, baskets of fresh produce, as gestures of goodwill. Others offered to help repair the damage left behind by the Patriots' attack: broken fences, dented equipment, and scuffed walls marred by graffiti. A few simply stood, silently watching James work with quiet admiration. James wasn't prepared for the sudden outpouring of support. He had spent years feeling like an outsider in this town, tolerated at best and resented at worst. Now people looked at him differently, not with pity or indifference, but with respect. They spoke softly, almost reverently, about how he had single-handedly taken down more than a dozen armed men. "How did you do it?" one elderly farmer asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "You must have been a soldier or something." At first, James shrugged off the questions, brushing them aside with vague responses. "Just learned a thing or two over the years," he said, offering a tight smile. But as the morning wore on and more people arrived, curiosity grew harder to deflect. Finally, a young deputy from the local sheriff's department approached, him, notebook in hand. "Sir, can I ask you something?" he said cautiously. "Were you ex-military?" James hesitated, his fingers tightening around the hammer he was using to fix a fence post. For years he had kept his past hidden, burying the memories of war beneath layers of routine and solitude. The Medal of Honor tucked away in his wooden box was a relic of another life, one he had tried to leave behind when he moved to the countryside. Yet now, standing amidst the ruins of his property with dozens of eyes upon him, he realized secrets couldn't protect him anymore. The truth would come out eventually, and perhaps it was time it did. Slowly, James set down the hammer and walked inside the house. Moments later, he returned holding the small wooden box. Opening it, he revealed the gleaming metal nestled within. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people recognized its significance. "This is real," someone whispered, stepping closer for a better look. James nodded, his expression unreadable. "I served in the Marines," he explained quietly. "Did tours overseas, saw things no one should ever see. When I came back, I wanted peace. That's why I chose this place, to start over, to build something good." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Here was a man they had dismissed as just another outsider, someone whose presence had made them uncomfortable. And yet, he was a hero, a decorated Marine who had risked his life for their country. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While the Patriots prided themselves on being patriotic, it was James who had truly fought for freedom and justice. As news of James's identity spread, so did a wave of shame among the townsfolk. Many admitted to themselves that they had turned a blind eye to the Patriots' behavior, too afraid to speak up. Others confessed they had doubted James's intentions, assuming he didn't belong because of his skin color. Now, faced with the reality of who he was, they felt compelled to make amends. Over the next few days, volunteers poured into James's farm, working tirelessly to restore what had been damaged. Children tagged along, eager to watch the hero farmer in action. Strangers introduced themselves, offering friendship where there had once been silence. Even local authorities took notice. Law enforcement, which had previously been slow to respond to complaints about the Patriots, launched an investigation into their activities. Officers combed through evidence, interviewed witnesses, and pieced together a case strong enough to dismantle the gang once and for all. Arrest warrants were issued for those involved in the attack on James's property, and within weeks, several members, including their leader, were behind bars. Without leadership or numbers, the rest of the gang scattered, disappearing into obscurity. Despite the newfound attention, James remained grounded. He declined most offers of media interviews and public appearances, preferring to focus on rebuilding his life. Still, he couldn't ignore the impact his actions had on the community. Town meetings became forums for discussing issues of racism and prejudice, with residents vowing to create a more inclusive environment. School teachers invited James to speak to students about his experiences, hoping to inspire younger generations to stand against hate. Though reluctant at first, James eventually agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to plant seeds of change. One chilly autumn morning, James found himself standing in front of a classroom filled with wide-eyed children. They listened intently as he recounted stories of his time in the Marines, not glorifying war but emphasizing the importance of courage, teamwork, and standing up for what is right. When he finished speaking, a young boy raised his hand timidly. "Mr. Anderson," the boy asked, "are you scared of anything?" James paused, considering the question. Then with a soft smile, he replied, "Of course I get scared. Everyone does. But fear doesn't have to control us. Sometimes doing the right thing means being brave even when you're afraid. That's how we make the world better. One choice at a time." His words resonated deeply, not just with the children, but with everyone who heard them. In a short span of time, James had become more than just a farmer or a veteran. He was a symbol of resilience, proof that strength comes not from violence, but from conviction. People began looking to him as a leader, someone who could guide them toward unity and understanding. Though James never sought such a role, he accepted it graciously, knowing the responsibility that came with it. By winter, the scars of the conflict had begun to fade. Repaired fences lined James's property, freshly painted barns gleamed under the pale sunlight, and laughter echoed across fields once marred by hatred. Neighbors who had once avoided James now stopped by regularly, sharing meals and swapping stories. Even those who had initially distrusted him embraced him as part of the community. Slowly but surely, the town transformed, not overnight, but in ways that mattered. Yet amidst the healing, James remained humble. He continued tending his crops, rising before dawn and working until dusk. To him, farming wasn't just a livelihood. It was a metaphor for life itself. Every seed planted represented hope, every harvest a testament to perseverance. And though challenges still lingered, whispers of lingering prejudice, fears of future threats, James faced them with unwavering resolve. He had proven to himself and others that peace was worth fighting for, even if the fight wasn't easy. As snow blanketed the countryside, James stood on his porch, gazing out at the land he had fought so hard to protect. The air smelled crisp and clean, carrying with it the promise of renewal. Behind him, the wooden box containing his Medal of Honor sat safely on the kitchen counter, a reminder of battles won and lessons learned. But today, James chose to focus on the present. The friendships forged, the lives touched, the community reborn. Whatever storms lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home. Months turned into years, and the once tense atmosphere of the small farming community gave way to a newfound sense of unity. James Anderson's farm became more than just a place to grow crops. It transformed into a symbol of resilience and hope. People from all over the county began visiting, not only to see the man who had stood up to hate, but also to learn from his quiet strength. The scars of the past were still visible. Faded graffiti marks on the barn, patches of uneven grass, where tires had torn through the fields, and the occasional glances between neighbors recalling darker days. But these remnants served as reminders of how far they had come. James adapted to his role as an unofficial leader in the community, though he never sought the title. He welcomed visitors warmly, sharing stories not of glory but of perseverance. His talks often centered around themes of courage, forgiveness, and the importance of standing together against injustice. "Hatred thrives when we're divided," he would say, leaning against a fence post while children sat cross-legged at his feet. But love? Love grows stronger when we stand side by side. The town itself underwent a transformation. Inspired by James's example, residents organized events celebrating diversity and inclusion. Potluck dinners brought families together, with recipes passed down through generations shared alongside laughter and conversation. A mural was painted on the side of the local library, depicting hands of different colors planting seeds in rich soil, a tribute to James's vision of growth and unity. Even the annual Harvest Festival took on new meaning, with proceeds going toward scholarships for underprivileged students. Yet despite the progress, challenges remained. Old prejudices didn't vanish overnight, and whispers of dissent occasionally surfaced. Some former members of the Patriots resurfaced, attempting to regroup under different names or ideologies. But this time, the community was ready. Neighbors banded together, reporting suspicious activity and supporting one another in ways they hadn't before. When threats arose, people stood shoulder to shoulder, refusing to let fear take root again. One crisp spring morning, James received a letter that caught him off guard. It was from a national veterans organization inviting him to speak at their annual gala in Washington, D.C. The invitation praised his service both overseas and at home, calling him a beacon of hope in troubled times. For a moment, James considered declining. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, and the thought of leaving his farm, even temporarily, felt unsettling. But then he remembered the faces of the children who visited his fields, their eyes wide with admiration and curiosity. If sharing his story could inspire others to fight for what was right, he owed it to them, and to himself, to accept. The night of the gala arrived and James stood backstage, adjusting the lapel pin adorned with the Medal of Honor insignia. The ballroom buzzed with energy, filled with men and women in formal attire honoring those who had served. As James stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, some curious, others reverent. He gripped the podium tightly, feeling the weight of expectation settle over him. "Thank you for having me here tonight," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I'm not much of a speaker, so I'll keep this short. Many of you know about my time in the Marines, the battles I fought overseas. What you might not know is that the hardest fight of my life happened right here, on a quiet patch of land, in a small town." He paused, scanning the sea of faces. "When I came back from war, I wanted peace. I wanted to escape the violence and hatred I'd seen abroad. Instead, I found myself facing a different kind of enemy, one fueled by ignorance and fear. At first I felt alone, like no one understood what I was going through. But then something incredible happened. My neighbors rallied around me. They saw beyond the color of my skin, beyond the uniform I once wore, and recognized me as a human, being deserving of respect." His words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from the audience. "That's why I'm here today. Not because I'm special, but because we're all capable of making a difference. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared. Compassion isn't about agreeing with everyone. It's about seeing their humanity. And change? Change starts when we choose to stand together, instead of apart." As James concluded his speech, the room erupted into applause. Tears glistened in the eyes of many attendees, including fellow veterans who nodded in solidarity. For James, however, the real reward came later, during conversations, with individuals inspired by his message. A young soldier recovering from injuries sustained in combat told him he now believed in second chances. A mother thanked him for giving her son hope that kindness could triumph over cruelty. These moments reaffirmed James's belief that every act of bravery, no matter how small, mattered. Back home, life continued much as it always had. James returned to his routines, tending to his crops and welcoming visitors eager to hear updates about his trip. Yet there was a subtle shift in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that his influence extended far beyond the boundaries of his farm. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, thanking him for his courage and offering words of encouragement. Local newspapers ran follow-up stories highlighting his impact, dubbing him the farmer who changed a town. Even the landscape seemed brighter somehow. Spring rains nourished the earth, coaxing vibrant green shoots from the soil. Flowers bloomed along the roadside, their colors vivid against the clear blue sky. Children played freely in the fields, their laughter echoing through the countryside. And James, watching it all unfold, felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the beauty surrounding him, but for the connections forged through shared struggles. One evening, as the sun dipped, below the horizon, James sat on his porch with a cup of tea. The day's work was done, and the world stretched out before him in hues of gold and crimson. Across the yard, a group of teenagers gathered around a bonfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Among them was Sarah, the daughter of a neighbor who had initially been wary of James. Now she regarded him like family, often stopping by to help with chores or simply chat. Tonight she waved at him, her smile lighting up the dusk. "You should join us," she called out, motioning toward the fire. James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe another time," he replied. But as he watched the flickering flames cast dancing shadows on their faces, he couldn't help but feel a pang of pride. These kids represented the future, the next generation determined to break cycles of hatred and build bridges instead of walls. And though he knew challenges lay ahead, he trusted they would rise to meet them. That night, as James drifted off to sleep, he reflected on how far he and the town had come. From isolation to belonging, from fear to courage, from division to unity. It hadn't been easy, nor had it been quick, but every step along the way had been worth it. Because in the end, it wasn't medals or headlines that defined a person. It was the lives they touched, the hope they planted, and the legacy they left behind. And James Anderson? He had done more than survive, he had thrived. Years passed, and James Anderson's story became a cornerstone of the community's identity. His farm, once a battleground against hatred, flourished into a thriving testament to resilience and unity. The fields stretched wide and green, dotted, with wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. Children ran through the rows of corn, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. Neighbors gathered for picnics under the shade of ancient oak trees, sharing stories and meals while watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was hard to imagine that this peaceful place had once been marred by violence and prejudice. James himself remained unchanged at his core, still humble, still grounded. Though he had earned recognition far beyond the borders of his small town, he never let fame or accolades define him. To the people who mattered most, he was simply Mr. Anderson, the farmer who grew tomatoes as big as softballs and always had time for a chat over a cup of coffee. Yet even in his simplicity, there was an undeniable aura about him, a quiet strength that inspired everyone fortunate enough to know him. The lessons James taught weren't confined to speeches or formal gatherings. They were woven into everyday life. When disagreements arose between neighbors, people remembered his words. Hatred thrives when we're divided, but love grows stronger when we stand side by side. They resolved conflicts not with anger, but with understanding, striving to see each other's humanity despite differences. When new families moved into town, they were welcomed warmly, their backgrounds celebrated rather than questioned. Slowly, but surely the scars of the past faded, not erased but transformed into reminders of how far the community had come. One autumn afternoon, as golden sunlight bathed the countryside, James received another letter. This one came from a university professor who had written a book about modern-day heroes. Enclosed was a draft chapter dedicated to James's story, asking for his input before publication. As James read through the pages, he found himself smiling, not because of the glowing descriptions of his bravery, but because of the emphasis placed on collective action. The author highlighted not just James's fight against the Patriots, but also the way the entire town had rallied behind him, proving that true change required teamwork. James scribbled notes in the margins, adding anecdotes and corrections where needed. "It wasn't just me," he wrote in reply to the professor. "If my neighbors hadn't stood up too, none of this would have happened. Courage isn't a solo act. It's something we build together." The professor incorporated James's feedback, and when the book hit shelves months later, it became a bestseller. Readers across the nation were captivated not only by James's personal journey, but by the broader message of hope and collaboration. Requests for interviews and speaking engagements poured in. But James accepted only a handful, choosing instead to focus on what truly mattered, nurturing his farm and fostering connections within his community. As winter approached, James spent more time indoors, reflecting on the years that had flown by. He often sat by the fireplace, flipping through old photographs and letters. There was a picture of him receiving the Medal of Honor, surrounded by fellow Marines whose faces now belonged to memories. A faded postcard from a soldier he'd mentored during his military days. Handwritten notes from children who had visited his farm, thanking him for teaching them about courage and kindness. Each item carried its own weight, its own piece of history. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, a young boy knocked on James's door. Wrapped in a thick coat and scarf, he held out a drawing. "I made this for you," he said shyly, his cheeks flushed from the cold. The picture showed James standing tall amidst shadowy figures, sunlight breaking through clouds above. In bold letters at the bottom it read, "You're my hero." James knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," he said softly, accepting the artwork. "But remember, real heroes aren't perfect. We make mistakes, feel scared, and sometimes doubt ourselves. What makes us heroes is choosing to do the right thing anyway, even when it's hard." The boy nodded thoughtfully, then grinned. "Can I visit your farm again soon?" he asked. James chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Anytime you want." That night, as James hung the drawing on his wall alongside others like it, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had never sought fame or fortune. All he had ever wanted was peace. And though his path had been anything but easy, he had found exactly what he was looking for, not just in the land he cultivated, but in the lives he touched along the way. Spring returned, bringing with it the promise of renewal. James worked tirelessly preparing the soil, planting seeds that would sprout in the coming weeks. Volunteers joined him, eager to lend a hand. Among them was Sarah, now a teenager, who had grown up hearing James's stories and learning from his example. She worked beside him, her hands caked with dirt but her spirit alight with purpose. "You think this year will be better than last?" she asked, gesturing to the freshly tilled earth. James smiled, leaning on his hoe. "Every year gets better," he replied. "Not because the work gets easier, but because we keep trying. That's how progress happens, one step, one seed, one choice at a time." By summer, the fields were alive with color and abundance. Families visited weekly, marveling at the fruits of James's labor. Tour buses occasionally stopped by, carrying tourists eager to see the farm that had become legendary. James welcomed them all graciously, sharing tales of struggle and triumph without ever seeking credit for himself. To him, the farm wasn't just his legacy, it belonged to everyone who had played a part in shaping it. As the seasons continued their endless cycle, James grew older, his movements slower but no less deliberate. Wrinkles etched lines around. His eyes and his hair turned silver, yet his presence remained as commanding as ever. People still sought his advice, finding comfort in his wisdom and reassurance in his steady demeanor. Even those who hadn't known him personally spoke of him with reverence, passing his story down to younger generations as a reminder of what could be achieved through courage and compassion. When James finally passed away on a quiet autumn morning, the entire town mourned. Flags flew at half-mast and churches held special services in his honor. His funeral drew crowds from near and far, filling the local chapel to capacity. Friends, family, and strangers alike shared memories of the man who had changed their lives forever. In death, as in life, James left behind a lasting impact. His farm became a community center, hosting events and educational programs aimed at promoting unity and understanding. A plaque was erected near the entrance bearing a quote James had often repeated. "Strength isn't about fighting battles. It's about building bridges." Visitors paused to read the words, feeling the weight of their truth. Decades later, long after James's name had faded from headlines, his legacy endured. School children studied his story in history classes, learning about the farmer who had stood firm against hatred and inspired a town to rise above division. Farmers adopted his methods, cultivating crops and relationships with equal care. And in every corner of the community, people carried forward the values he had championed: courage, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of unity. Though James Anderson was gone, his spirit lived on, in the laughter of children playing in the fields, in the friendships forged across differences, in the seeds planted by countless hands. He had proven that one person could indeed make a difference, not through grand gestures but through steadfast determination and love. And as the sun set over the countryside, casting its golden glow across the land he had loved so dearly, it was clear that James's story would continue to inspire for generations to come.